You rely on this podcast to stay informed and connected with your local community, and we rely on you. Without listener support, this show simply wouldn't exist. Be a part of the team that makes this show possible by donating to our home, KUOW. It only takes a minute. Donate at KUOW.org or follow the link in the show notes. And thank you.
You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Denkman. The Department of Children, Youth, and Families, which oversees Washington State's foster care system, celebrated a milestone last week. The number of children in foster care has dipped below 5,000. That's down significantly from over 9,100 kids in foster care in 2018, a reduction of more than half in 6 years. This is seen as progress among experts who have pushed for states nationwide to keep children with their parents whenever possible. Splitting up families can do lasting harm to kids and disproportionately affects people of color. But critics of the approach say the policy shift has created a situation where the state may be leaving children in harmful situations too long, especially when parents struggle with addiction or mental health issues. Nina Shapiro is a reporter for the Seattle Times who has been covering this issue. And Nina, thank you so much for being back on the show.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
So let's just get to the basics here. The number of children in Washington's foster care system has dropped really dramatically in the last 6 years. What are the reasons behind that?
Well, the state has been moving in this direction for a while, and certainly the Secretary of DCYF, Ross Hunter, has said that he wants to dramatically cut the number of children in foster care. And there are very good reasons for that. Taking children away, separating parents from their kids is one of the most traumatic things that can happen for parents and for children. And a lot of people think that that harm outweighs the potential benefits of going into the foster care system. Plus, a lot of the reasons that many children go into the foster care system are related to issues that many see as linked to poverty. For instance, they might not have decent housing, they might not have access to childcare, and that can cause kids to be left alone for a period of time. So those aren't the only reasons. Those can contribute to other things going on, but those are some reasons. And so there has been a movement to provide services to families that will keep them together safely rather than taking away the children.
Mm-hmm. Addressing some of those issues like socioeconomic issues that are contributing to the children potentially being in a situation where they're taken away from their families. Tell me about this 2021 Washington state law. It made it more difficult to separate children from families. What are the basics of what that law has done and how is it playing out?
Yeah, so this is a due process issue in part, and it has to do with the standard that is used to take children away initially, which is often done on an emergency basis. And then there's a court hearing. And at the court hearing, there used to be a standard called a serious threat of substantial harm to the kids. And that was changed in this new law that took effect about a year ago. And the new threshold is imminent physical harm. So it's a raised standard. There's more that the state needs to prove before separating kids from their parents for any length of time. And this has had a big effect. It has led to about 14% less separations, or at least since the law was passed, the numbers dropped by about 14%. It's not the only reason that the numbers have dropped. There's been this change in practice on the part of DCYF for some time, but this accelerated the change, and it is a source of controversy. Not many people, but some critics feel that the standard is too high. And there was an attempt to change that somewhat because of the fentanyl epidemic. So you may recall that in the last session, there was a new bill that came forward that talked about the standard when opioids are in the home.
Mm.
And it didn't exactly raise the threshold, but it required courts to give great weight, that's the language, great weight to the fact of opioids being in the home.
Mm-hmm. And factor that in when they're going through that court proceeding about whether to remove the child. So I know that DCYF, the Department of Children, Youth, and Families, is celebrating this reduction. I want to get to some of the criticisms in just a minute, but what do they say about, what they've achieved here in terms of lowering the overall population of the foster care system in the state?
They say this is, very good news. This is something they've been working on for a long time. This has to do with a different approach, that they're both trying to avoid separating kids, but another piece of it is also trying to return kids to their parents sooner. And they also say that they develop safety plans when they feel like there might be some risk. It doesn't meet the threshold, but they want to keep families together.
What kinds of resources are there in terms of those safety plans? So, for example, we've talked a little bit about the idea of trying to provide more economic support, more housing assistance in order to help support keeping families together or reuniting families. Are there other resources that DCYF is reaching out with when there are concerns about a child in a home, but the state is not at the point where they want to try to pursue removing a kid from that situation?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a really good question. So DCYF says that they are, providing supports, and there certainly are some. I mean, they have the ability to make referrals to mental health treatment, to substance use treatment. There are some physical things they can provide, like beds and diapers and that sort of thing. They can bring in kind of parenting coaches type people, people who come into the home, look at the family dynamic, problem solve. In terms of safety plans, they say they will kind of set up some backup plans, like if there's a crisis in the home, identify people who the children can stay with, or they can, say that they're going to do unannounced home visits. But, there are certainly people, and I've been hearing from them, particularly foster parents, who feel like children that have been with them have been returned unsafely to their birth parents. And sometimes bad things have happened, and they would point to the number of deaths and near deaths that happen with kids who have been touched by the foster care system in some way in the past 12 months, and that there's a state ombuds who comes out with those numbers every year, and those numbers have gone up quite a bit. Now, I just want to say that those numbers also relate to kids who are in foster care. So it's not just kids who are in the care of their parents. So these are, bad things happen when kids are when kids are removed,
Yeah.
and bad things happen when kids aren't removed. So there is a balance here that the state is trying to strike, and it's tricky. But I certainly have been hearing from foster parents about that concern, and I think that that's something that we have to pay attention to. And then there are also some concerns by some people who, very adamantly believe that we should keep families together, that the state was separating, kids from their parents way too often, but believe that there isn't the kind of support for those families that there should be. Not that they should be separated, but that those families may still need help,
Yeah.
and that DCYF is not providing that help. Or, I mean, what many people will say is that that help should preferably come outside of the child welfare system, because CPS is like an incredibly scary agency, right?
Yeah, when child welfare is involved,
Yes.
the threat is there that you may have your children taken
Right.
away. So,
Right. And
even coming with services, I imagine it's a very alarming thing to have anybody knock on your door and said, hi, we're from the Department of Children, Youth, and Families, or CPS. Like, that is that is terrifying for parents. So I can understand that that is not, for many people, the ideal way to deliver
Right.
services.
Yes, you're exactly right. It's super scary. And
Yeah.
so some people talk about, a warm handoff to community organizations. I will say, like, one of the interesting things I heard was that, so there's this kind of in between period where CPS is investigating, but they haven't taken away the child or decided whether they're going to file for removal. And during that time, there are supports they can offer. But when they close a case, they no longer offer supports. So I was hearing that sometimes during that period of time, they'll say, well, we could give you, housing vouchers or this kind of thing. And then they close a case and that support disappears. And parents have made themselves vulnerable by saying, like, we need this help. And so that there was that concern by actually a couple of lawyers who represent parents. But then there's also the larger question of whether those kinds of community services exist to help parents. And there are a lot of community supports, but there are also things that are lacking. And DCYF in a recent report it did talked about the lack, for instance, of community drug treatment facilities, and I think there is, especially places where parents can go with their kids, sometimes pregnant parents with newborns or something. Those facilities are very helpful and sought after.
So we have DCYF and a lot of people who advocate for keeping families together, say that outcomes are better for kids when they are with their birth families and not in the foster care system. They're celebrating this drop in the overall population of the foster system in Washington state, which has been super dramatic over the past 6 years. But then we also have critics who say that they have seen an uptick in the number of kids who are touched by the foster care system having near death or actually dying, in the past 12 months. However, as you say, Nina, that is really hard to separate because we are not just talking about people reunited with their families. We're also talking about people in the foster system. I mean, what's the next step here? What are you going to be watching for as this unfolds and these questions about the right way to care for the kids in Washington state continue?
Well, I think, we can watch and see if there's anything that might come out of the legislature. I don't know if there's going to be any new movement, but I will say that I talked to Patrick Dowd, who's the state ombuds for DCYF, about what he thought, because he's the one who comes out with these reports on deaths and near deaths and does this analysis. And so I asked him, did he think that this was linked to the new state law raising the threshold or a change in approach for DCYF? And he said it was way too soon to tell. It's a good question. It's something we should think about. But he thought it was probably more likely linked to the overall fentanyl epidemic. So I think the evidence is not yet in. I think we need to hear more about the situations in which people feel like, for instance, kids are being returned to their parents too soon. Certainly one of the ongoing issues for DCYF is that they don't have enough staff. Their caseloads are too high to really monitor these families in the way that they ideally should. So, whether the legislature will do anything with funding, I mean, that might be one thing to take a look at, but I think we need to keep monitoring that and see how this issue is playing out.
Yeah. So this is early days. And again, people are watching numbers. They're watching data come in. They're listening to anecdotal conversations about the status of kids who are showing up in the foster system. But it is still really difficult to measure the success or the challenges of this effort by the state and the nationwide push to try to keep kids together, again, with their families. And I really appreciate your reporting on this, and I know we're going to keep watching it. Nina Shapiro is a reporter at the Seattle Times, and she's covered this big drop in the population in Washington state's foster care system in the past few years. Thank you so much, Nina.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. And hey, this show is only possible because listeners support us. If you are able to give right now, check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m., Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org.
Hi there, I'm Monica Guzman, host of A Braver Way podcast and your guide across the political divide. Are you done with the divisiveness in our politics and ready to do something about it? This season, we've partnered with KUOW to reach more listeners like you. Join me as I sit down with guests from across the political spectrum. Together, we'll share tools, insights, and messy, real-life stories to help you face this election year without losing heart. Listen to A Braver Way now on the KUOW app or wherever you get your podcasts.